When we think of the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, we often picture ships laden with fragrant spices. We imagine the scent of nutmeg, cloves, and mace filling the air, a story of commerce and adventure across vast oceans. But you know, this romantic image hides a much darker truth. The VOC was not just a trading company, it was a thief, but it stole something far more precious than the aromatic bounty of the Spice Islands. It stole food from the mouths of children. It stole sovereignty from local rulers. It stole the very fabric of communities, leaving behind a legacy of hunger and oppression that would haunt generations. The story of the VOC is not merely one of trade, it is a story of profound and calculated violence against both people and the land itself. The true cost of a pound of nutmeg was not measured in Dutch guilders. It was measured in the lives lost to starvation and the brutal suppression of any who dared to resist. The company's quest for a monopoly was relentless and absolute. To achieve it, they did not simply outcompete their rivals, they systematically dismantled the economies and social structures of the places they colonized. They saw the world not as a collection of diverse cultures and ecosystems, but as a giant plantation, a resource to be extracted and controlled. This worldview, which separated humanity from nature and valued only that which could be converted into profit, was the ideological weapon that justified unimaginable cruelty. The VOC's ships carried not just spices, but a new and terrifying form of power. This narrative begins with a simple yet powerful desire to control the global supply of rare and valuable spices. Nutmeg and mace, for instance, grew only on a tiny cluster of islands in the Banda Sea. For the VOC, this geographical fluke was an opportunity for immense wealth. The plan was simple in its brutality: seize control of the source, eliminate all competition, and dictate the price to the world. This strategy required more than just building forts and deploying soldiers. It required fundamentally re-engineering the societies of the Spice Islands, turning self-sufficient farmers into forced laborers and powerful sultans into compliant administrators. The VOC's charter gave it the power to wage war, sign treaties, and establish colonies, making it a state in its own right, a corporate state with a single-minded devotion to profit. So, when we speak of the VOC, we must look beyond the ledgers and shipping manifests. We must see the faces of the farmers forced to burn their own food crops to make way for clove trees. We must hear the stories of the village leaders executed for daring to trade with anyone other than the company. The spices that graced the tables of wealthy Europeans were seasoned with the suffering of entire populations. The true legacy of the VOC is not found in the museums of Amsterdam, but in the scarred landscapes and fractured communities of the East Indies. It is a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of monopoly, fueled by a mechanistic view of the world, can lead to the systematic destruction of human life and culture. The VOC's strategy for controlling the spice trade was one of total domination. It was not enough to be the biggest player in the market, they had to be the only player. This quest for an absolute monopoly began with the forceful seizure of land and the violent suppression of anyone who stood in their way. In the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg, this policy reached its most terrifying conclusion. The company systematically depopulated the islands, massacring or enslaving thousands of the original inhabitants. They did this to ensure that no Bandanese person could ever again trade nutmeg with the English, the Portuguese, or any other rival. The islands were then repopulated with enslaved people and Dutch overseers, creating a vast nutmeg plantation run with ruthless efficiency. This brutal model of control was replicated in different forms across the archipelago. The VOC established a network of forts and trading posts, not just for commerce but as centers of military power. These forts were symbols of a new order, projecting the company's authority deep into territories once governed by local sultans and rajas. The company's fleet, one of the largest in the world, did not just carry cargo, it patrolled the seas, hunting down and destroying any local or European ships attempting to engage in what the VOC deemed smuggling. This meant that a farmer from a nearby island trying to sell his cloves to a Chinese trader was now a criminal, subject to the company's harsh justice, which often meant execution or enslavement. The company's legal and administrative power grew to match its military might. They signed treaties with local rulers, but these were treaties between unequals. Often rulers were coerced into signing agreements that gave the VOC exclusive rights to all the spices produced in their lands. These contracts, known as contingent N, obligated local populations to deliver a fixed quantity of spices each year at a price set by the company, a price that was always far below the market value. Refusal to comply was met with swift and violent retribution. The VOC's power was absolute, its reach extending from the palace of the Sultan to the smallest village garden. It was a corporate machine designed for one purpose: extraction. This iron grip choked off all other forms of economic life. For centuries, the Spice Islands had been a vibrant hub of maritime trade, a crossroads where merchants from Arabia, India, China, and the local archipelago met and exchanged goods. The VOC systematically dismantled this network. They destroyed the ships of local traders, blockaded ports, and imposed a rigid system where all trade had to flow through the company. Local communities, which had once been active participants in a global economy, were now reduced to the bottom of a supply chain they could not control. Their economic freedom was gone, replaced by a state of complete dependence on a distant, powerful, and utterly indifferent corporation. At the heart of the VOC's oppressive regime was the forced cultivation system. This policy was simple in its logic but devastating in its consequences. The company forced farmers in specific regions to abandon their traditional agricultural practices and grow only one crop, the spice that the VOC desired for export. On the island of Ambon it was cloves. On the Banda Islands it was nutmeg. In parts of Java it was coffee or sugar. Farmers were no longer allowed to decide what to grow on their own land. Their fields, which had once produced a diverse array of food crops like rice, sago, and vegetables, were transformed into monoculture plantations serving a distant European market. This was a profound act of violence against the land and the people who depended on it. This system was enforced with meticulous cruelty. The VOC dictated not only what to grow, but how much to grow. Company officials would survey the land and assign production quotas to each village. Failure to meet these quotas resulted in severe punishment for the entire community. To ensure compliance, the VOC carried out annual expeditions known as Hongatashtan. These were punitive naval patrols that would sail through the islands, inspecting villages and plantations. If they found that farmers were growing food crops instead of the mandated spices, or if they discovered any unauthorized spice trees that could be used for smuggling, they would destroy them. These patrols were instruments of terror, reminding everyone of the company's omnipresent power. The price paid to the farmers for their crops was set by the VOC and was deliberately kept at a bare subsistence level, sometimes not even enough for that. This was not a negotiation, it was a decree. The farmers were trapped. They were forced to dedicate all their land and labor to producing a commodity they could not eat, and in return, they received a payment that was barely enough to survive, if that. This system ensured that the vast majority of the wealth generated by the spice trade flowed directly into the VOC's coffers in Amsterdam, while the people who actually grew the spices were kept in a state of perpetual poverty. It was a perfectly engineered system of wealth extraction. This transformation of the agricultural landscape was a radical break from centuries of tradition. Indigenous farming practices were based on biodiversity and sustainability. Farmers understood the rhythms of their local environment and cultivated a mix of crops that ensured food security and ecological balance. The VOC's monoculture system destroyed this intricate knowledge. It treated the land as a factory floor, and the farmers as cogs in a machine. By forcing a single crop upon the soil, the company not only made communities vulnerable to famine but also damaged the long-term health of the land itself, setting the stage for ecological and social collapse. The most immediate and devastating consequence of the forced cultivation system was widespread famine. When farmers are compelled to grow non-edible cash crops like cloves or nutmeg on land that once grew rice and sago, the result is predictable. Food production plummets. Communities that were once self-sufficient, able to feed themselves from their own fields and gardens, suddenly found themselves without a local food source. They became entirely dependent on importing food, a cruel irony considering the fertility of their own lands. The very soil that could have nourished them was instead being used to produce luxury goods for European consumers. Hunger became a constant and menacing presence in the Spice Islands. The VOC was not ignorant of this problem. In fact, their policies made it worse. With local food production destroyed, the company controlled the import of rice, the primary staple food. They became the sole supplier, and they used this power to further entrench their control. The rice was sold to the local population at inflated prices, often in exchange for the very spices they had been forced to grow. This created a vicious cycle of dependency. Farmers had to hand over their valuable spice harvest for a meager payment, and then use that payment to buy back overpriced food from the same company. Any wealth they might have accumulated was immediately siphoned away, keeping them impoverished and reliant on the VOC for their very survival. The famines were not just unfortunate side effects of VOC policy, they were direct outcomes of a system that prioritized profit above human life. There are harrowing accounts from this period of entire villages starving to death while their clove trees flourished. In times of poor rice harvests in Java, the source of the VOC's supply, the company would reduce shipments to the Spice Islands, leading to catastrophic food shortages. The people of the islands were at the mercy of distant supply chains and corporate decisions made thousands of miles away. Their fate was tied not to the rain or the fertility of their own soil, but to the balance sheets of the Dutch East India Company. This man-made hunger represented a profound spiritual and ecological crisis. For generations, the land had been seen as a source of life and sustenance. The relationship between the people and their environment was one of reciprocity and respect. The VOC shattered this relationship. The land was no longer a nurturing mother. It had been turned into a cruel master that demanded labor but offered no food in return. This created a deep sense of disorientation and despair. The famines were not just a failure of agriculture, they were a sign that the entire world had been turned upside down, that the fundamental principles of life and sustenance had been broken by the insatiable greed of the company. Before the arrival of the VOC, the Indonesian archipelago was, a complex mosaic of kingdoms, sultanates, and principalities. Rulers like sultans and rajas held significant political, economic, and religious authority. They commanded armies, controlled regional trade networks, and were seen by their people as the legitimate centers of power. The VOC recognized that to control the spice trade, they needed to control these rulers. However, outright conquest of every kingdom was costly and honestly just impractical. Instead, the company perfected a strategy of manipulation, turning powerful sovereigns into puppets who served the company's interests. This was a quieter, more insidious form of colonization, but no less effective. The VOC's primary tool was the unequal treaty. The company would use its overwhelming military superiority to coerce a ruler into signing a contract. These treaties often began with promises of alliance and protection against the ruler's local rivals. A sultan facing a threat from a neighboring kingdom might see the VOC's offer of ships and soldiers as a welcome advantage. However, this protection came at an exorbitant price. The treaties invariably included clauses that granted the VOC an exclusive monopoly over the region's valuable products. The ruler was now legally bound to sell all his kingdom's spices to the company at a fixed, low price and to forbid his people from trading with anyone else. Once a ruler was locked into such a treaty, his power began to erode rapidly. He was no longer the master of his own economy. The wealth that had once flowed into his treasury from trade now went directly to the VOC. This financial weakening made him even more dependent on the company for support. Furthermore, the VOC would often interfere in palace politics, supporting one prince over another in succession disputes. By backing a favored candidate with money and military force, they could ensure that the next person to sit on the throne would be someone loyal to the company. In this way, local dynasties were hollowed out from within, becoming mere extensions of the VOC's corporate will. The people saw this transformation clearly. Their sultan, once a powerful and respected figure, was now visibly taking orders from a Dutch trade official. He was forced to implement unpopular VOC policies, such as the forced cultivation of spices or the punishment of so-called smugglers. This undermined his legitimacy and authority in the eyes of his own subjects. He was trapped between the demands of the company and the needs of his people. Many rulers who resisted this puppetry were deposed, exiled, or executed. The VOC effectively dismantled the traditional political structures of the archipelago, replacing them with a system of indirect rule where local leaders were little more than managers for a foreign corporation. The VOC was unlike any entity the world had seen before. It was not a nation, yet it acted like one. Its founding charter, granted by the Dutch government, gave it honestly just unprecedented powers. The company could build forts, maintain its own army and navy, negotiate treaties, wage war, and even administer justice in the territories it controlled. This made the VOC a state within a state, a sovereign power in its own right, operating far from the oversight of its home government. In the East Indies, the company did not just trade, it ruled. It established a corporate kingdom whose only law was the pursuit of profit, and its authority actually superseded that of local kings and sultans. This new form of sovereignty was impersonal and bureaucratic. Traditional rulers, for all their flaws, were connected to their people through ties of culture, religion, and lineage. Their power, while absolute, was embedded in a social context. The VOC's power was different. It was the power of a faceless organization, managed by directors in Amsterdam and administered by officials who saw the local population not as subjects to be governed, but as resources to be managed. This corporate state was governed by ledgers and balance sheets. Decisions that affected the lives of millions were made based on calculations of potential profit and loss, with no regard for human consequences. The legal system imposed by the VOC reflected this corporate sovereignty. The company established its own courts and its own laws, which were primarily designed to protect its monopoly. The most serious crime in the VOC's domain was not murder or theft, but economic disobedience. A farmer selling a handful of cloves to a non-VOC trader was committing an act of treason against the company state. The punishments were swift and brutal, intended to make an example of the offender. This legal framework institutionalized the company's economic dominance, turning free trade into a criminal act and transforming local populations into a captive workforce. Justice was, in effect, a tool of corporate enforcement. This corporate kingdom was a forerunner of modern colonialism. It demonstrated how a commercial enterprise could seize the functions of a state to create a system of total economic control. The VOC's innovation was to merge corporate power with sovereign power, creating a hybrid entity that was accountable to no one but its shareholders. This model would be copied by other colonial powers, but the VOC was the pioneer. It established a world where the lines between commerce and government were blurred, where the authority of a merchant could equal that of a king, and where entire societies could be restructured to serve the interests of a single company. The VOC's monopoly did more than just make the company rich. It systematically impoverished the people of the Spice Islands. This was not an accident but a deliberate design. The entire economic structure was built to create dependency and prevent local communities from accumulating any wealth or power of their own. The first and most important chain was the price mechanism. By being the sole buyer of spices, the VOC could dictate the price. They paid farmers a fraction of what the spices were worth on the open market in Europe, or even in other parts of Asia. This ensured that the producers of this immense wealth remained poor, while the company reaped enormous profits. The second chain was debt. The low prices paid for spices often meant that farmers could not cover their own living expenses, especially since they also had to buy food from the VOC. The company was more than willing to provide advances and loans, trapping farmers in a cycle of debt. A farmer who owed money to the VOC was even more tightly bound to its system. He had no choice but to continue producing spices for the company, as his debt could be used as leverage against him and his family. This debt peonage was a powerful tool for ensuring a compliant and permanent labor force, turning free farmers into something akin to serfs on a corporate estate. The third chain was the destruction of local industries and trade. Before the VOC, the islands had diverse economies. People were not just farmers, they were also shipbuilders, weavers, potters, and long-distance traders. This economic diversity created resilience and prosperity. The VOC saw these local industries as a threat to its control. By monopolizing all shipping and trade, the company put local merchants out of business. By flooding the market with cheap imported textiles, they destroyed local weaving industries. This deliberate de-skilling of the population made them even more dependent on the single economic activity the VOC permitted, growing spices for export. This architecture of oppression created a society with no economic mobility. There was no way for a farmer or a local trader to improve their situation. All paths to prosperity were blocked by the company. Any surplus they might have produced was immediately captured by the VOC through low prices, high taxes, and control over essential goods. This system was designed to be inescapable. It locked communities into a permanent state of subordination, where their labor served only to enrich a distant corporation. The economic chains forged by the VOC were as strong as any iron shackles, binding generations to a future of poverty and dependence. The VOC's most profound and lasting damage was the systematic destruction of self-sufficiency. For centuries, the communities of the Indonesian archipelago had lived in a delicate balance with their environment. They possessed a deep, accumulated knowledge of the land and sea. They knew which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, and how to cultivate a variety of crops that ensured they would have food throughout the year. Their economies were largely local and sustainable. They produced what they needed and traded their surplus with neighbors. This self-sufficiency was the foundation of their culture, their resilience, and their freedom. The VOC saw this independence as an obstacle and dismantled it piece by piece. The forced cultivation of monoculture spice crops was the primary weapon in this assault. By compelling farmers to dedicate their land to a single export commodity, the VOC severed the direct link between the people and their food source. A farmer's hard work no longer resulted in a full storehouse of rice or sago. It resulted in a pile of cloves that he could not eat. This created a fundamental dependency. For the first time, entire communities had to rely on an external, often hostile entity for their daily bread. This loss of food sovereignty was a catastrophic blow, turning independent producers into dependent consumers. This dependency extended beyond food. The VOC's monopoly on trade also destroyed local crafts and industries. The art of building sturdy trading prahus, passed down through generations, fell into disuse as the VOC's ships dominated the seas. The intricate knowledge of navigating by the stars and currents became less relevant in a world where local shipping was outlawed. Traditional markets, once vibrant centers of social and economic exchange, withered away as all commerce was forced through the company's channels. The rich tapestry of local economic life was unraveled, leaving only a single thread, the one that led to the VOC's warehouses. This loss of self-sufficiency was also a loss of knowledge. The complex ecological wisdom that had sustained these societies for centuries began to fade. When a community is no longer responsible for feeding itself, the intimate understanding of soil, water, and biodiversity starts to disappear. The younger generations grew up in a world where the only agricultural skill that mattered was the cultivation of the cash crop demanded by the Dutch. This erosion of traditional knowledge was one of the most insidious forms of colonial violence, leaving communities not only poor and hungry, but also disconnected from their own heritage and environment. The Dutch East India Company was officially dissolved at the end of the 18th century, but its shadow lingers over the lands it once dominated. The damage it inflicted was not temporary, it was structural, cultural, and ecological, creating wounds that have yet to fully heal. The most visible legacy is the persistent poverty and economic vulnerability in many of the regions that were once at the heart of the VOC's empire. The economic structures built by the company, based on the extraction of raw materials and the suppression of local development, created a pattern of dependency that has been difficult to break. The wealth of the Spice Islands was siphoned away for 2 centuries, leaving a legacy of underdevelopment. The ecological scars are also deep. The VOC's model of monoculture farming degraded the soil and destroyed biodiversity in many areas. Forests that were cleared for plantations led to soil erosion and disrupted water cycles. The introduction of a purely extractive mindset, which viewed nature as a commodity, replaced a more holistic and sustainable relationship with the environment. This legacy of ecological damage continues to affect agricultural productivity and the resilience of local ecosystems today. The quest for short-term profit left a long-term environmental debt that is still being paid by the descendants of those the VOC oppressed. Perhaps the most tragic legacy is the loss of culture and tradition. The VOC's reign was a period of immense social dislocation. Communities were shattered, rulers were stripped of their authority, and ancient traditions were broken. The knowledge systems that had been the bedrock of these societies, their agricultural practices, their navigational skills, their social organization, were deliberately undermined. While cultures are resilient and many traditions have survived, a great deal was lost forever. The memory of this trauma is embedded in the collective consciousness of these communities, a story of a world turned upside down by foreign greed. In the end, The story of the VOC is a stark reminder that the theft of spices was the least of its crimes. The company stole food, sovereignty, and self-sufficiency. It re-engineered entire societies and ecosystems for the sole purpose of profit, treating both people and nature as disposable commodities. This dark history is not just a relic of the past, it is the origin story of a global economic system that continues to place corporate profit above human well-being and ecological balance. To understand the world we live in today, we must look back at the lingering shadow of the VOC and recognize the devastating price that was paid for a pound of spice.